welcome. This is the Millennium Park Partner Stage at the American Writers Festival. I'm Linda Dunleavy, Director of Development at the American Writers Museum, and this is our next program sponsored by StoryStudio Chicago. A crucial part of the mission of the American Writers Museum involves inspiring the future of great American writing, teaching people to find their own voice and claim authority over their stories. It's a mission we share with this program's presenter, StoryStudio Chicago. And now I'm going to introduce Rebecca Mackay, Artistic Director of StoryStudio Chicago, to introduce our panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. As she said, I'm Rebecca. I'm an author. I'm also the person who oversees a lot about StoryStudio, which is an organization that's been around since 2002. We're located physically in Ravenswood, right off the Irving Park Brown Line stop, but virtually now everywhere. Silver lining of the pandemic. What we are is a studio for people to come and take writing classes of all levels, all lengths of time, all genres, and for every age from middle school to adult. You could think of us as like the Old Town School of folk music for writing, if that makes sense. A lot of our students are getting published in pretty major ways. Others are just there because it's a hobby. We have everything in between. I've felt like it would be obnoxious to foist a thing into everyone's hands, but on the chair by the door, there are a lot of flyers that tell you about StoryStudio. If you're here because you're a writer as well as a reader, this is the home for you. This is the place in Chicago. If you are only a reader, we would invite you to join us in those ways too. We have a book club called The Geek Out, where two pretty amazing writers talk about a book they love, a classic, and everyone reads it. So in July, right down the block at Exile in Bookville, which is in the Fine Arts Building, we have the Chicago writer Julia Fine and the writer Katie Gutierrez talking about Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. It's a wonderful book. So you reread it, or you read it, or you start it, and you come to that event, or you watch online, because we're going hybrid. So if you're just a reader, that's the thing to do, and if you're a writer too, we want to come see you. So everyone up here on this panel that I'm about to introduce is both a writer and an instructor at StoryStudio. So many writers teach as well. Not only because it's how we make a living, but because we care deeply about getting stories out of other people, and because we're communicators. That's what we do, and communicating what we do to other people is something we love. So I'm going to start down in the end. That is Juan Martinez. He is the author of the short story collection Best Worst American, but coming in spring of next year, he has his first novel. It's called Extended Stay, and I'm so excited. His work has appeared in literary journals all over the place, McSweeney's, Tri-Quarterly, Conjunctions, if those mean something to you, which they should. He's incredible. He lives in the Chicago suburbs and teaches at Northwestern. Next down the line is DIONNA Griffin-IRONS. She is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the Second City U.S. and Canada. You might have heard of the Second City. She's a Second City Detroit alumna with 18 plus years experience as a performer, producer, and facilitator. She has taught tons of workshops at colleges, women's shelters, corporate boardrooms, and I did not see this, has worked with the United States Embassy in Norway and Latvia for real, DIONNA? Oh my God. Introducing improv as a tool for social change. She, for StoryStudio, teaches for us a lot, and most recently has been working on our partnership with the Illinois Prison Project, something we're really happy about. Moving down the line, we have Jack Gems, who used to live here in Chicago, and we lost her, maybe temporarily. I don't know, we can convince her to move back to San Diego. But Jack is the author of the novels Total Work of Art, My Only Wife, and The Grip of It, and the short story collections A Different Bed Every Time and False Bingo. Winner of the Chicago Review of Books Award for Fiction and finalist for the Story Prize. And she teaches creative writing at UC San Diego. And finally, moderating our panel is Frances DePontes Peebles, who is the author of the award-winning novels The Seamstress and The Air You Breathe. She's a 2020 Creative Writing Fellow in Literature from the National Endowment for the Arts. A native of Pernambuco, Brazil, she holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Her stories have appeared all over, and she also teaches for us regularly. I know that they're going to be talking both about writing and maybe reaching other younger writers, newer writers in the way that they can. And I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. I'm just going to get out of here and hand it off. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much to the American Writers Festival for having all of us. And thank you all for being here. It's a glorious day, and you're in here talking and thinking about writing. So we really appreciate you being here. So this panel is called Crossing Borders. And I was thinking about that a lot, and I was thinking that a border is kind of, in my mind, like a demarcation or a fixed line, or kind of an arbitrary boundary that once you cross it, you're settled in another place and kind of fixed there. And I think that all three of you, your work kind of defies that limitation. And when I thought about it, I thought about, in Brazil, we have this god of the crossroads named Exu, and he's kind of a gatekeeper to the spirit world, right? And he lives at the crossroads. He's this trickster, he's a shaman, he takes many forms. And he offers choices and possibilities to humankind. So to get anywhere, to any of the deities above him, you have to go through him, and you have to step into this crossroads of this intersection, right, of many things. And it can be really scary because it's a place of uncertainty, but also a place of great possibility. And that's how I think of the work of these three authors and improv facilitators. So I wanted to start off by asking you what crossroads or intersections are you asking us to stand in when we experience your work? Jacques, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's I love that as a place to start. So I feel like there are a few different ways that I can answer that question. Like, I think that the most obvious answer that comes to my mind is that each story, each writing project, each book, for me, ends up being something so totally different from the last thing. Like, I have a historical fiction book coming out next year, but my last novel was a haunted house horror novel. And before that, it was a sort of lyrical, fragmented narrative, domestic story of a marriage. And then each of my stories, that are even more wildly different from one another in their own right, too. But then I also started out as a poet. I still write poetry sometimes. I write creative nonfiction, too. I've started doing some screenwriting as well. So it's like, that's the easiest way to answer that question. But then the other thing that comes to mind for me is thinking about the way that I hope that, and the reason that each of the projects is different is because when I start out writing, I don't know what it's going to be. And so opening myself up to, moving through that kind of trickster gatekeeper and letting myself follow whatever path seems of most interest or seems like it has is most alive with energy. Like, that's the thing that I love most about the writing process, right? Is letting myself just figure out where I am or where I've traveled to, and then working with that, what's ended up on the page. But the other thing that it makes me think about is the way that that I hope that every individual reader is also invited into a totally individual and different experience in their own right. And so when I'm composing my work, I think about reader agency and leaving a certain level of openness to the narrative that invites the reader to fill in gaps and imagine their own interpretation of the story and their own understanding, and think about what is going unsaid. So that that they're projecting into as they're reading. And sometimes that's very frustrating for readers, because readers sometimes really like to have all the answers. But that's something that I'm always thinking about. And so those are kind of the two different levels that I respond to that question on.
It's wonderful. I just want to make one correction. I'm the longtime former director at Second City. After 21 years, I wanted to focus more on writing and teaching. So I'm so delighted to be in the space to teach more and write more. When I think of border, I think of the internal borders and limitation that exist inside all of us. And a lot of my work I've taken into spaces with women, with prisoners, with corporate professionals, with young adult at-risk teens. And I just think there's just so much to unlock inside of us. I think that the border exists internally inside of us as human beings, and that we're always trying to break free out of something, the label, the identity, the role, and we all have so many different roles, and that in itself is a border, if you will. You know, mother, actor, daughter, improviser, and then having to cross over from that role, having to cross over the border of that to, you know, it's like, okay, I don't have my mommy hat on today, I have my writer hat on today, and I have my teacher hat on today. And so I think of border as the internal borders that we have.
Actually, I was going to begin with something else, but like what you just said reminded me that it is weird, right? Like the borders always imply like this binary, right? You're like, on one side of it, you're one thing, and then you move over, cross the border, and then you become something, expected to become something else entirely. Yeah. And I think a lot of the stuff that happens with, like at least my own writing, is my inability to successfully make that crossing cleanly, I guess is what I would say. But what I was going to say before you pointed that out is I was born in Colombia, and I didn't really fully move to the U.S. until I was 16. So for me, like the idea of crossing borders has been had a very literal meaning of like, oh, I'm a Colombian citizen living in the U.S., or I'm an international student living in the U.S., or I'm somebody who's been living in the U.S. for too long and now talks with a funny accent in Spanish when I go back to Colombia, right? So that created its own weird crisis. But then the other strange border for me is that I grew up loving, like a lot of kids do, and like science fiction and fantasy and horror. Those were like my first and still probably like most powerful reading experiences. Were the ones that I was having when I was 11 or 12 and reading, you know, Peter Straub or Stephen King or those guys. And so when I went and studied writing at school, you sort of learn very quickly that that's not the writing you're supposed to be doing, and it took me a moment to get back to it, sort of like acknowledge that you can do all of it, right? That you can go from stuff that has a lot of severed heads to stuff that still has a lot of severed heads, but is, you know, also long paragraphs. I don't know. Like so that's the other way that I think about like borders, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So DIONNA, I wanted to talk to you in your work. I watched your TED Talk, and you talked a lot about surrendering to the moment, tricking the brain to turn the ego off, and to trust your own instincts. And I felt like so much of that was about us giving ourselves permission to do what we need to do as artists and as people. And so I want to know, what permission did you have to give yourself to do the work that you do?
Oh my goodness. I had to say yes to myself. I've been a yeser, a pleaser type gal, and I'll always be the yes pleaser, and that's a good thing if you use it positively, and have boundaries, personal boundaries, where, you know, yes to yourself and to the healthy risk in your life, and saying yes is also saying no to the things that may impede upon your time of the work that you really want to do. So permission has been a huge navigating what is the yes for my moment, for my life, that's going to elevate me, that's going to allow me to grow, and being okay with saying no. Being okay with saying no. And in my 20s, I had a hard time saying no, and so it took me off my path. into other directions where I had to like figure out, where am I going? What the hell is going on? Oh my goodness. And so permission is huge. And I think in that, it's permission to fail. And permission to fail, to know that I get to make all of these mistakes, and that making the mistakes is part of the success and part of the process, and not judging myself in that way. So that's been huge for me. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. So Jack and Juan, so Jack, in the grip of it, your narrators are kind of caught in a small town and in a house, which are kind of very traditional places, right? And in Juan, I read the preliminary report on the conditions of the camps, and it's this wonderful short story that's set. It's kind of a newsletter. It's in the form of a newsletter, a corporate newsletter from the future. And so I think, in my interpretation, both of you play with this idea of the terrifying horror of like the everyday in things. And so can you speak about that intersection of like the everyday and terror, and what inspires you about that?
It's a really, really good question. And one way that this is like a very weird way of answering that question first, but I love haunted horror novels in general, because when something is wrong with a house, that is something that I adore. I mean, Shirley Jackson is one of those people who is just hugely formative for me. And, you know, I read Jack James in the grip of it. Right around the same time I read Daniel Kelman's You Should Have Left. So I was like, oh, this is great, this is great, this is great. And I had never lived in a house before, but we bought one this year. And then I realized, oh no, it's legitimately horrifying, right? It's a legitimately a horrifying thing, because A, you're responsible for everything, and everything is falling apart immediately. Like or everything could fall apart immediately, right? So and I realized that that's sort of like a slight terror that is there in late capitalism with everything. It's like everything is this promise that everything's gonna be okay, right? This surface is gonna be gleaming, you know, gorgeous, everything is, but it's like literally falling apart. Like as the moment that even as you're staring at it, right? So that is, I think, the disconnect that I try to articulate sometimes in that. And that comes with language too, especially with corporate language, when you try to, in that story, it's a cultural affairs attaché for a camp that's supposed to be a work camp, but it becomes increasingly horrifyingly clear that it's basically a concentration camp. And horrible things are going on, and this narrator is trying to insist on the fact that everything's okay when things are literally, there's gigantic bugs that are falling out of the sky while he's saying everything's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. At the time that I wrote the grip of it, I still have not owned a home. I own a condo now, but a home is a different thing. It's because you have land. There's something about land that seems extra terrifying to me. I mean, I could explain, but yeah. Who owns land and who can stake that sort of claim? For me, talking about why a haunted house is sort of like the house that you live in becoming the site of terror is, it goes back to Freud, right? And his idea of the uncanny, which translates to literally in the German, unheimlich is unhomely. And so that idea of the familiar being made strange, and like the house is the perfect container for that. And so in that book, the other thing that's being made strange is that there's a married couple that is slowly realizing that like their grip or like view on reality is very different from one another. And so that's, you know, the house that they're living in is becoming unfamiliar and terrifying to them, but it's also that their relationship with one another is becoming troubled. And so, you know, taking this sort of metaphorical house and then showing, and this is a thing that I return to over and over again in my work, is that, and I didn't know that I was returning to it for a long time, but then you realize you just keep writing the same thing over and over again in different forms, is this idea that no matter how well you know another person, there's always going to be like that, even if it keeps getting smaller, that little bit of space between you where you can't know everything that's going on in their mind or in, you know, what has changed their mind from the last time you saw them. And so that, like, that feels like the ultimate border or boundary to me, is that, like, you know, you can be so intimate with another person, but there's still a space.
Nice. Going back to something Dionna said, is there, about the labels that we place on ourselves or the borders that we kind of impose on ourselves, or that maybe a culture has imposed on us and then it becomes ingrained in us, whether we know it or not, and then we realize it. Is there a work of writing or a work of art that has allowed you to see that and release you from that? This is for all three of you, but we can start with Dionna.
Oh, wow. Is there a work of art? You know, I read, I had a moment where I spent a bit of time in a jail. I also taught the women in jail, and I read many, many books, from Taoism to spiritual books, to Tony Robbins, Awaken the Giant Within, to the Quran, to the Bible, and I also read a lot of poetry, and I'm trying to think if there was a specific book. Well, my childhood book, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, always comes back to me as the core book, and I have this affinity for birds. Oh man, I'm a birder. I'm an amateur birder. Last summer there were, and here's a tangent. I'm deviating from this, but last summer there were like 5 blue jays that came into our backyard, and I caught a picture of it, and the cardinals, and there's like little finches and yellowbirds. And so there's just something about that book, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. Yeah. Birds that are all around us, and this idea of freedom, and how the birds come in and out of our lives and our spaces, and if we recognize that. Well, during this time I was incarcerated, I would see these birds, and they would come in. I would count how many that would come in through the door, and I would write them down. I just started paying attention to nature and how nature was starting to speak to me and inform me, and that kind of opened more of my spirituality. That helped with my writing. That helped to overcome the label. And in that particular environment, it was a huge label. You're this, you're this, you're this, you're this. You know, you go into different institutions and you have a label that's attached to you. Sometimes it's around gender, it's around race, it's around economic status, and then sometimes it's because of a crime, and you are, you know, connected with something, and all of a sudden you have a label. And so I had to find ways to overcome this imposed label that was put on me, because it's like, I'm not that, you know, that label, you know. And so that was huge for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a bunch for me of writers who have done that, but I can definitely point to like somebody who's like ridiculously formative in a bunch of different ways. And when I was a teenager, still sort of like navigating, going between Colombia and the States, I was living in Bogota, had dropped out of college, I was writing for an English language newspaper, and there was this lending library where you could just, like, it was run out of a church by a bunch of American expats And you could like, I think you paid like 5,000 pesos, which is nothing, and then you could check out whatever for like the whole year. And I discovered Nabokov there, like Vladimir Nabokov. And he was, it might have been Penin, it might have been Pale Fire, but you know, it was the idea of the exile, right? Like that you have a homeland that you can never get back to again. And I had never, it's a very weird place to sort of find a connection, but it was there. It's like, oh yeah, that's why we keep moving out of Colombia, right? Like we, you know, because it's not steady, right? So he was definitely that author for me, and it, you know, yeah, and I remain very, very grateful to his work for that reason.
I think I blacked out when you asked the question. You said a formative writer? Is that
or like formative writer or art that has, if you have kind of created limits or borders within yourself, what kind of released you from that?
Yeah, okay.
Or just a writer that you love?
No. Well, okay, so I feel like I remember, there are a number of different writers that occupy this position for me, but I remember my parents were very permissive as far as what I could watch or what I could read. Like, they didn't really question what I was into, you know? And so I feel really lucky that that there were times where I felt like I was being sneaky with the way that I was consuming literature. You know, like I remember, like my family, sometimes we'd like go to Barnes and Noble on a Saturday or something, and it was like, you can pick up work, and I'd like test my limits. I'd be like, Eric Bogosian's Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, you know, and my mom would be like, I'm like, it's a play. And my mom was like, okay, fine. Like, and so, like, I don't know, like, you know, I feel like they were always just like, okay, if you're reading, that's fine. Whatever you want to read, like, just do it, you know? And things turned out okay, you know? Like, I don't know, but yeah, so, I mean, so somehow, like, drama became the place where I felt like I started to, like, figure out some more experimental ways of approaching literature and making. But then I remember getting to undergrad and like I did a novel independent study with a poetry teacher that I had because I like didn't even think about it. I was just like, I like working with her the most, so I'll ask her to be my you know, my thesis mentor for this project. And she was totally game, but she assigned me a bunch of like pretty traditional novels to read together while I was trying to draft a novel. And they weren't bad. It was like The Corrections and White Teeth, and they were beautiful, you know, but they were the most popular novels at that moment. And at one point I asked her, I said, what's your favorite novel? And she said David Markson's Wittgenstein's Mistress, which, if you know it, is this very like lyric, it's like almost like reads mostly like a series of facts. But also the woman who's telling the story is potentially the last woman on Earth, and she's just sort of wandering the streets and trying to figure out if she is in fact the last woman on Earth. And that novel blew my mind open because I was like, this is a novel? Like, I don't know what to call this, but you're telling me it's a novel? And so like, I feel like that was a book that just like changed everything for me.
So you're all teachers, correct? Mm-hmm. So for your students, and also for everyone here, for all of us to learn, what do you do to encourage them to kind of figure out their intersections or crossroads, or where there's this fluidity that's really beautiful instead of a stark boundary? How do you do that for your students?
I confess that I kind of like I'm a big believer in asking them what they're into, and then sort of like giving them as much of that as that I myself am enthusiastic about and love. And I found that actually that's weirdly the case, especially when people say they're into science fiction or or fantasy or horror, and then I asked them what they love, and they mentioned somebody, so well, that person's lovely, but they died like 50 years ago, you know, you can't talk to them anymore. And then I just try to compile a list of like, these are the people I really love right now, this is what they're writing, these are some of their stories. Oftentimes, for a lot of writers, a lot of beginning writers, I think that they're really, they'll go for novels, and so I'll give them like a list of like really cool short stories that are like the novel that they love, but that was written, this year or the year before. Yeah, that's like one of the places I'd be. And then the more you're drawing from, the more you can, find what your intersections are.
Yeah.
I throw a lot, because I come from improv, and I'm from a theater background, we play a lot of games.
Cool.
A lot of games. I do that for writers as well, because I think that it's important to get back to the childlike essence of who we are. And so, we talk a little bit at the top, but then we are doing eye contact games, we're doing sound ball games, I'll throw something out like, woo, and you have to catch woo, and throw out a new sound like, ah, And so I try to get us out of our heads very, very quickly and into our bodies, and laughing. And in that serves as a diagnostic where I can kind of see, one, it puts us all on the same level of play, and there's no hierarchy in the class. And so then we get to, that serves as a diagnostic where I can just kind of see, like, okay, who's a little bit, inventive, clown-like, maybe a bit more introverted and shy, and then I kind of do a little bit of, I customize my classes like a little bit of a prescription on that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I think that maybe similar to Juan, like when I'm looking at when I'm forming my syllabi, figuring out what they're going to read. I do err on the side of short stories because most of what they can write in their classes, what you can actually fit into getting done in a quarter or on the quarter system, is a story. And I want them to work on stories because so many of them want to write novels, and I'm all for it. But they're going to do. So many of them are doing that on their own, but they've never finished one. And having to write a story from beginning to end and figure out what the full shape of it is, I know that the scale of a novel is very different, right? But it's still, like such a valuable exercise. And so when I'm putting my syllabi together and figuring out what we're going to read together, I try to look at, I try to choose current writers too, because I feel like they're getting a lot of older writers in their literature classes, which they have to take plenty of. Not that there's not so much value in older stories, and sometimes it's older work that's just recently been translated for the first time, and so it's in the conversation, because I feel like that's such an important thing for writers that they don't realize, is that it's tough to make your way in the writing world when your only point of reference is James Joyce or Flannery O'Connor or something like that. It's like it's so helpful when you know who the people are who are out there making work right now. So trying to get as many different perspectives and voices and identities onto the syllabi. Onto the syllabi as possible, and stories that are really taking some chances. So I think that ultimately what I'm maybe trying to do for them is to recreate that moment that I had where I was like, this is a story? Like what, because, so often it just seems like it unlocks something for them, and they'll start taking these chances where they thought, oh, okay, it has to be this set of things, and just letting them feel that sense of play, like DIONNA was saying, and possibility. Well, there was something else I was going to say. Oh, and just, I mean, to your question, you know, I mean, I know that everyone knows this text and it's beloved, but I think it's beloved for a reason. Like in my, in a creative nonfiction class that I was just teaching this week, we were talking about Gloria Anzaldua's How to Tame a Wild Tongue. And so we were talking about all of the different voices and vernaculars that each of the students has and all of the different ways that they carry themselves in the world depending on context, and thinking about which one of those do you write from, or all of them, or is it possible to use different ones to write different pieces, and what does that do for the work, and yeah.
So I want to leave time for questions from our audience. But I do want to get this question in. I have so many questions for you all. So a twist on the "what are you working on now" question is, for me, what intersections or mysteries in our present reality are inspiring you, and what are you creating from that inspiration?
I'm really growing more and more obsessed with, I think it was always there, but like affluence and inequality, and the ways in which those seem to be deranging in some ways. Like they seem to shift reality so intensely for people, and not just the Kardashians, even though the new season on Hulu is like a
Exceptional.
cognitive, except it's delicious. But it's like this bouquet of cognitive dissonance, right?
Yeah.
Like there's just a bunch of like, why are you walking in black leotards all the time?
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
why is there a buffet table at your kitchen? And it seems
Chef?
yeah, it is the
Chef? Yep.
So it's so not but so that's, and complicity, right? Those three things together are things that I'm really kind of finding that kind of go to.
I'm doing a lot on visibility and inclusion, this idea of being seen. So a lot of my work is kind of focusing on that and not seen. And so I think the huge part that I'm finding, just because there's so much that happened with the pandemic, and there's so much around of marginalized voices and not being seen, not being heard, and a lot of it for me, focus is to turn it inward and to first see ourselves before we're waiting or expecting others to see us. And I think the huge thing, I know it's so outwardly focused, I want to be seen, I want to be seen, I want to be seen, but for me, it's all about seeing yourself first in the world. And so how does that show up how do you navigate and live your life by seeing yourself fully?
Mine feels maybe related to what Juan was talking about. I have this project that I've been working on for a long time, and I don't know when it will feel like it's ready for the world, or maybe if ever. But it's this project where I record every transaction that I have, where it's where every trip to the grocery store, or every exchange of goods or money or services, and observations that I make during those actions too. And it was something that I started, I've probably been working on it for 6 years now. But it was, what it was highlighting was the way in which, as people consume more and more via online shopping and ordering and delivery and things like that, the way that relationships between human beings are breaking down. And then the pandemic happened, and I was like, well, now this feels obvious, now everybody's thinking about what it means to just be in your home and not want to have to call to order dinner even, you only want to be able to do it if you can order it on a phone or something, and so, yeah, I don't know, now I feel like everything that I sort of thought I understood about that project from just a late stage capitalism perspective has changed because of our existence in the world has changed so drastically and so quickly. So I think it'll be a long time before I figure out what that means for turning that into. At the time, I thought it was going to become some sort of speculative novel where a person slowly like disappeared as they were interacting less and less with the environment around them. But now my experience of the pandemic and people's attempts to kind of crawl out of it and figure out life again is changing what that narrative feels like to me.
All right, so I'd love to open it up to questions. We don't have a mic that goes around, unfortunately, but so if you have a question, stand up and let us hear your voice. Yes?
I have a question. So I'm a writer wannabe because I've been in IT for many years, and now I finally have time to do this. I once had a creative writing teacher that said, when we were children, we didn't have the borders of grammar. So in 5 minutes, just from your heart, write whatever you want on paper. And I could not believe how the writing that people did and what they recited. So how are you weighting some of the grading? Is it like on creativity, or is it on the grammar?
Yeah, I tell my students they can do anything they want with grammar as long as they're consistent on the page. Like as long as it's clear that they're making their rules and following their rules, I'm fine with that. So that's how I grade that sort of thing. But for the most part, when I'm grading the student work, it's they're revising something that they've written in class. So what I'm seeing happen is, they get full credit. They get all the points for the first draft. As long as they turn in the number of pages I ask them to turn in, and usually the minimum is very low. There's a higher limit, large page number. So if they want to write longer, they can. But then what I'm looking for in terms of giving them a grade for the class is seeing how did you engage with the work, seeing what comes out of that next revision, and they write a reflective essay that talks about the process of how their work, thinking about their work changed over the course of the quarter or two.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. I do a lot of reflective essay questions or mini questions throughout the term so that by the time they have to do their final paper, they have already had context on what the subject is that we're studying, and they can personalize what they've been studying, what they've been learning, and hopefully I'm looking for that nugget of truth where they can connect and personalize something that's meaningful, that what they've studied is now, here's where I want to use my voice.
I just realized that it's going to be a very similar answer, and I'm just going to try and spin it a little bit. So I believe in grading on process, right? So I tell them I can't actually have really bad taste as a human being in a lot of stuff, in art, definitely. It's just so I'm not here to judge whether your thing is great or not, because there's no way, you shouldn't trust me if I'm telling you it's great. There's probably, So I believe in grading on process, just right. Did you turn in the pages? Did you do the thing? And that's one of the primary things. And I think what a lot of us are trying to do is to create the environment that somehow replicates some of the stuff that has worked for us when we figured out, oh, this is how I can trick myself into writing a story and not freaking out in the middle because it's not the genius thing that I thought was in my head, and what am I going to, so what are sort of the things that we can do to facilitate the things that any one individual writer will be able to do once they're out of school, right, to do the thing on their own. I feel that's sort of like, and I think a lot of writers do that. Like it's, and you also realize the thing that may work for one person may not be perfect for another one, so you just try to give as many tools, and then they can create their own toolkit with it.
I just want to add really quickly, sometimes like StoryStudio, no one's grading anything.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
They're talking about undergrad and graduate.
Yeah, yes.
They do. Sometimes like StoryStudio, everyone's there because they want to be. There's no, it's professional,
Yeah,
Yep.
yes.
Yeah.
And I think because the goal is you want to become a better. I think in some ways, I kind of take that attitude into like academic environments as well. That if you're here, if you want to take this class, it's because you want to be a writer. Here's what you can do. Yeah.
Any other questions?
It's a good question.
Yes.
A question to panelist number one.
Mhm.
You said you were a poet, and I'd like to know, do you have a book of poems, and what is it called?
No, I do still write poetry, but I don't have a book of poetry, no. But I do think about, I use all of those things that I learned from poetry in my prose now. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just a little curious, going back to the borders thing.
Yes.
You had mentioned about the familiar becoming strange, and then you were talking about exile and kind of being forced out of a place and crossing borders. I did not live in the United States for about 10 years, and in that 10-year period, I only spent about a month within the country borders. And I got forced here with the pandemic because I was getting a visa processed, and 1 month in, they stopped allowing flights back to China. So I very literally was here on a holiday that became a life. I'm using this as an example because I was teaching in international schools for local students preparing for American universities. And something that I also found that was close between myself and them is that it wasn't necessarily that it was a border crossing or a transition like what you've talked about. It was more like a border becoming closed, where it was an active choice because they've outgrown where they've been or because they cannot go back.
Wow.
Like I'm originally from Cleveland. I purposely have not gone back to Ohio because there's too much of a difference between what is nostalgically in my head and what I would be confronting with who I am now versus when I left in 2007, right? And so how do you find yourself guiding someone, again, because I'm in your position as an English teacher too, how do you find yourself guiding someone through that transition of the oxymoronish position of loss, but also relief, and like that kind of juxtaposition of feeling? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I apologize, it's really complicated.
No, that's a good question. Well, I think Jack mentioned, and also Gloria and Elsua, and she has the iconic, the Borderlands book, right? It's where she literally talks about like both the arbitrary nature, the liminal nature, the sort of like weird thing that a border really is. And I think that's something that I keep coming back to. Like the poet Salma Sharif did just released a book called Customs, which is literally all about like that process, right? How do you go from one country to the next, right? And I'm always sort of struck by the fact that these are very arbitrary borders, right? It's a fake line, right? And it's a fake line that is fraught with meaning. And yeah, I'm sorry, that's also a very convoluted answer to your question, but it's I try to be mindful of the fact that we all have these and that we've all been at one or another of those. Yeah.
You make me think. I was born in Akron, Ohio, so Buckeye. You made me think of a personal experience of not wanting to go back to Detroit, where an incident happened, where my sugar daddy was, in my 20s, and how I avoided that place for so long. And then you made me think of an acting exercise that my teacher taught. We were reading Desire Under the Elms, and I was playing Desdemona, and he gave me this piece where she's bawling in so much emotion. I mean, it was really a high stakes piece, and I had to start at such an emotional intensity with this piece. And when I first did it, and I was saying my lines to the other actor, it couldn't penetrate me. The wall was just up, the border was up. Mm-hmm. And my acting teacher said, shake her. And I was delivering my line, but it just couldn't penetrate, just shake her. And in that moment, what I learned is that I penetrated the border. I went back, and I learned that I could use my past. And what my acting teacher was saying, your past cannot harm you. You can mine it. It's sense memory. And for actors and performers, we rely so much on the past, and writers, we rely so much on the past because that's what we mine from and get all our material back. So there has to be a wanting to go back and to know that it is a safe place that we can use when we are, when we're psychologically ready, when we're emotionally ready. And that takes time. And that is a question for each person that you're dealing with on what are those mental blocks that when you're navigating loss or trauma that happen in these environments and spaces, then how do you look at that? And you have to look at it from different angles. And that, I think, if you look at it from different ways, gingerly, that then you can know that it's okay to go back and that it is a resource for you and not a place of harm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the thing that I respond to in your question is this idea of coexisting grief and relief, and to me it feels like those moments of friction, those places where things like that butt up against each other, that's how a project forms. That's why I write, is so that I can think through those contradicting things on the page together, and that question of not knowing where to begin or how to begin, that's how I use writing. So I mean, I wish there was an easier answer for that, right? But to me, it's just, it also reminds me of I just saw an interview with the Ukrainian poet Valzhina Mort, and she said that the place where there isn't language for something, where there isn't a name for a feeling or an emotion or an event or something, that's the place that poetry begins. And that's how I feel about this idea of when you are feeling two things that feel like they can't coexist, then how do you move forward knowing that you contain both of those things?
Time.
It's a great question.
Yeah, it is.
All right, well, I think it's time. Can we squeeze one more?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I back in the day, heard of writing short stories, long story, acting, theater, and producing. Before COVID hit, I did a lot of improv, theater, acting stuff. But right now, it's there's times when my cognitive kind of races when it's time for me to write a piece. It's my psyche just wants to take over and run over everybody with these thoughts and stuff. But, and then there's a part of me right now that wants to put all that to the curb. I'm a little tired of those toys. And what I'm more interested in now is the outline of a memoir. Because I feel like those are all little toys from the past. I've enjoyed them, and I enjoy them a lot when I do them. But I'm kind of looking to do something else right now. And then, there's another thing, is that at home, when I'm by myself, I see all these commercials on television saying, hey, we can publish your book, your story, for free. I'm kind of curious about that too. Those are the questions.
Beware of those commercials.
Definitely beware.
Beware of those commercials.
It's not that simple.
Right.
Thank you guys for being here because I was always I keep taking selfies with these commercials and stuff because I'm always kind of curious about what they're going up to.
All right, well, thank you all so much for your questions, for your presence, and thank you so much to our panelists. You are